Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, October 11th, 1991, in televised hearings over the nomination of Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court, Anita Hill gave testimony that Thomas had sexually harassed her while he was her supervisor at the Department of Education and then at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Hill alleged that Thomas had repeatedly asked her out while they were working together, and then when Hill turned down his request, Thomas used work situations to bring up sexual topics and make lewd remarks. And this was a massive moment, a huge political event, a TV event in many ways, and lots more. It did not, of course, derail Thomas's confirmation. The Senate would vote 52-48 to confirm him a few days later on October 15th. But there's a ton to discuss here, revisiting the details of Hill's allegation, but also what it teaches us about confirmation hearings, which are obviously in the news, sexual harassment in the workplace, and Joe Biden's political career as well. So here to discuss it all, I'm joined by, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hey, Jody.
And also with us is Farai Chideya, my former 538 compatriot and also creator and host of the new public radio show, Our Body Politic. It is running on stations around the country. It is also a podcast. You will be hearing from Farai a lot this fall. Farai, hello. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks, Jody. Thanks, Niki.
So, lots of big questions to get to, but I feel like people sometimes maybe forget how we even got to Hill's testimony, and that's where I want to start. So we have these initial hearings around Thomas's confirmation, and by all accounts, they are looking like they're on track. The hearings sort of close, and then, Nikki, do I have this right? They kind of have to reopen in order to hear Hill's testimony.
That's right. So her testimony wasn't part of the initial hearings, but when word of it leaks to the press, that's when there is pressure to bring Anita Hill in order to get her testimony. Now, we should also say that she wasn't the only one who had these sorts of allegations. The Judiciary Committee talked to other women as well. They ultimately decided not to give those women a hearing. And we'll talk about more of the ins and outs of this. But I also if we're doing a timeline, let's point to the fact that she gives this testimony on October 11th, and he's confirmed on October 15th. So it feels like a fast process on that side of things.
Yeah. Farai, do you have any sort of memories of this as it was playing out in real time, or any thoughts on kind of how it played out in real time?
Well, I remember Anita Hill said that one of the things that before he was Justice Clarence Thomas, that Clarence Thomas had said, "Who put pubic hair on my Coke?"
Yeah.
Or something like that. And, as someone who was as young as I was just like, ooh, what? Yeah. That's so gross. And something that now stands out to me as we look back over the record is that Arlen Specter, a Republican senator from Pennsylvania, said that discussing large breasts in the workplace was common. And I'm like, yep, I'm sure that was true. That does not seem to be a defense, So it just says so much about the time capsule. I was kind of like a young, squicked out person who knew that this was an important moment. And then having watched Anita Hill grow into her fullness as someone who really stands up for people who speak out about sexual assault and sexual harassment has been part of my journey as an adult, kind of watching her step into her power.
Yeah, and we'll certainly get to that legacy. But I mean, on those allegations, the specifics of the allegations, there are certain things that strike you as gross and out of the norm, but then a lot of it just strikes you as like, oh, the fact that this is normal is the thing that really kind of feels like a gut punch. And that the way that Thomas talked to Hill and talked about sex at the workplace, and then Spector's remarks, a reminder that, you know, it's the normalization of it that is almost the most insidious part.
Right, and that sexual harassment wasn't language that was very common at the time. I mean, this is a point in time in 1991 where things like workplace sexual harassment just wasn't happening that much. It would become extremely common after the Anita Hill hearings. That's when people really were talking more explicitly about workplace harassment. But it wasn't just normalized. It really was just normal. This is how most workplaces in the U.S. operated in a lot of ways, including the Senate, which at the time of the Anita Hill hearings had 2 women senators and no black senators. And that shapes the kinds of conversations that are being had.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that in some ways the Senate has changed and in some ways it hasn't. If you look at the confirmation hearings for now Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, I think a lot of people would say that things have not changed that much, that there's a presumption of guilt on the part of women who make allegations about sexual harassment, that it still speaks poorly to somehow their morality much more than it impugns a man's morality. So, you know, some things have changed, but some things really have not.
Yeah, and I think there's also something here about the way that allegations get made and allegations come out. We saw this with a lot of the Me Too stories. We saw it with the Kavanaugh situation. But the fact that this came out after the official hearings had been, quote unquote, closed, and then this interview with the FBI that Hill had given was leaked to the press. You know, you read reports at the time and people were casting an air of suspicion around the allegations because of the timing. Like, why didn't these come out earlier? Why didn't she come out earlier? And, you know, that's kind of the point, right? It is hard for women to step forward and talk, especially black women to step forward and talk. They're not given a platform. They're not made to feel like they will be heard or believed. So there's this really deeply troubled catch-22 at the heart of all of this, which is that it is hard to come forward. And so women don't come forward. But then when they do come forward after a delay, the fact that it took a long time for them to come forward gets used against them to cast doubts on their allegations.
Yeah, there was also, Senator Dianne Feinstein was brought onto the panel. It had been a previously all-male judiciary panel. And so that didn't exactly make it gender equal by any means, but there were some moves to really recognize that our Senate and House, we have some deep disparities still, and they were more profound then, as you pointed out.
Niki, do you want to talk about the sort of the hearings themselves? I mean, they're televised. I'm interested in them as a sort of television event, and then also some of the major players. I mean, we talked about Orrin Hatch. Certainly, Thomas's reaction is memorable, and then we can bring up Joe Biden, who certainly plays a part in this whole drama as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a real reluctance among the members of the Judiciary Committee to really deal with this information. They realize that they kind of have to now that there is a public awareness of it, but they don't want to. And Thomas himself takes extreme umbrage at the idea that he has to answer these kinds of charges. He doesn't see them as disqualifying. He denies that anything like this ever happened. And at the time, he calls it a high-tech lynching because she's making these comments on television. And so brings in this kind of defensive-ness that ultimately is used to derail her as a black woman as his accuser. And so there's a really interesting set of tensions and positioning that's running through the conflict between Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill, and then, again, like the all-white senators who are adjudicating her accusations.
Farai, any thoughts on that high-tech lynching phrase? I think it's even...
Yeah, woo.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was just talking with someone recently. There's a group that is advocating for there being the first black female Supreme Court justice. And I actually got interesting pushback from another woman of color that said, that's how we got Clarence Thomas. And, you know, I personally think that it is really important to talk about the composition of the court from a demographic perspective. But there is a clear double-edged sword, because there were a lot of Black groups that supported Justice Clarence Thomas over Anita Hill, even though both of them are Black, supporting the idea that this man who had a chance to sit in the seat once occupied by Thurgood Marshall, that his race was more important than perhaps his politics, or that you just support the man in a situation like this. I think that there's tons of gender bias and patriarchy in every race, white, Black, purple. I am completely repulsed in a nation where lynching is real, and lynching had certain historical high watermarks, but never stopped. There have been people lynched throughout American history. For someone to invoke that as a term of art in order to protect their reputation, I just find extremely disturbing. And yet it was a trigger, I think, for a lot of people who protected Clarence Thomas during the hearings.
There's actually this term that is common in cases of harassment and abuse called DARVO. It stands for Deny, Attack, and Reverse Victim and Offender. And you actually see this when these very high-powered men suddenly cast themselves as the victim, and the women who have come forward, often in very difficult situations, often facing a lot of harassment just for coming forward, are positioned as the ones with all of the power and are the ones who are on the attack. So it's an experience that's actually common for a lot of women who experience sexual harassment.
And after the hearings, months after the hearings, reports of sexual harassment to the EEOC went up, I believe, by about 50%. Yeah. Many more people felt empathetic towards Anita Hill because they felt she'd been steamrolled. There were also other women who were not allowed to testify. So I feel like the term high-tech lynching definitely speaks to this idea of a selective use of history for one's own personal gain.
Let's talk about that stat you just cited. I mean, it's really amazing. So as you said, 1 year after this, complaints filed with the EEOC, which I will note is the agency where they worked. Irony, I don't know if that's exactly irony or what it is, but, the agency at which Hill and Thomas worked, the complaints there were up 50%. And as you said, public opinion kind of started to shift in Hill's favor. Niki, is that just, the power of a public reckoning, the power of seeing something on your TV just gives you a sort of model to have these kinds of conversations?
Well, I think it's more than that, right? I mean, in some ways, it was part of a kind of feminist consciousness raising that women got to hear another woman speak out publicly about sexual harassment that she'd experienced on the job. And that gave them both a language and an example to follow in filing their own complaints and being able to say, okay, I see how my experiences look like her experiences. And yeah, this is actually wrong. And of course, many of the women knew it was wrong, but now they were finding ways to come forward and to file their complaints. And I think that is a big moment. And it's happening in a lot of different ways, right? There are women filing complaints, but there are also women running for office. It is an important moment in a kind of woman-led activism in response to Anita Hill's testimony. So it refracts through a bunch of different places in American society, including the Congress.
Farai, what is your sense of Hill's legacy, her impact, both in as we've been discussing, in the year or two afterwards, but now in the decades since?
Well, again, I mentioned there's a group advocating for the first Black female Supreme Court justice to be put on the court. And they make a very compelling case that American jurisprudence and who gets put on the court also is a function of all of these different feeders towards the highest court in the land, which are in and of themselves blocking many different types of people from moving ahead. So, it's kind of like, it's not shocking when we look at Fortune 500 CEOs, because if you think of all the layers of discrimination that happen as people move up the ranks. And so I think that right now, America is justifiably obsessed with the Supreme Court. The future of the Supreme Court will be something that motivates lots of different types of people from across the ideological spectrum to vote. And I really, regardless of whether or not she is ever considered, I like the idea that Anita Hill's name has come up because it speaks to the endurance of someone who stood in her truth. This is another whole sidebar, but Justice Clarence Thomas, his wife, reached out to Anita Hill and asked her to apologize for smearing her husband. So there's been many different layers of this. And now, I thought it was really interesting that back when Joe Biden said he regretted the way that he handled the hearings, Anita Hill was like, nope, that was not enough. That wasn't a real apology. I mean, that's some spicy stuff. So it doesn't say anything about whether or not one should vote for Vice President Biden, but I do think that he will feel, Vice President Biden, if he is elected president, he will probably feel some pressure to really consider what kinds of people he gets to put on the court, if any.
Yeah. And so we should make it clear, both sides here, Hill herself and Clarence Thomas, and as you said, others in Clarence Thomas's camp, there has been no reconciliation here. Both sides, claim their own truth and continue to claim their own truth, and the heels are dug in. On the Joe Biden legacy, we've mentioned a few times that there were other witnesses and other women who were, waiting in the wings, so to speak, to also come forward. And it is, by all accounts, Joe Biden, who was the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, who kind of tamped that down and asked that the proceedings come to a close and go to a vote. And he has had to deal with this legacy. Niki, any thoughts on how much this is part of Biden's record, part of Biden's legacy, and how much it will define him if he does become president?
Oh, it's certainly part of Biden's record, and I think it got much more of a spotlight thrown on it nationally. I think a lot of people were already aware of it and already were frustrated with Biden because of this legacy. But in the wake of the national Me Too movement, when Anita Hill again becomes even more present in the national conversation around feminism and about women's rights and coming forward, it threw a pretty negative spotlight on Joe Biden for the role that he played in this. Now, Hill herself has, again, she's not accepted his apology, but she's also said that she would vote for him versus Donald Trump, since Donald Trump is facing a few dozen credible accusations of assault and harassment against him. So she's also modeled a kind of not black and white way of approaching something like this, where you have a choice between one person or the other. But I do think that she will continue to have access to Joe Biden, advising him and helping to shape his policies going forward. And she gets that seat at the table in part because he has been forced to recognize the wrong that he's done to her.
So as we wrap up here, Farai, I'm curious, if you just have thoughts about Supreme Court confirmation hearings in general. I mean, obviously we're in the midst of a fight right now, and who knows what twists and turns that will take. But, they've become so politicized. I think the TV element has a huge part of it. I guess my question is that, do you see any scenario in which these are actually useful for judging the things that we need to judge nominees to the Supreme Court?
I think that the Supreme Court fight, or the potential fight over the current nominee, is not going to get into questions of sexual harassment. There's a question, of course, of whether or not it will even be able to continue with the spreading of COVID among people who are members of the Senate and members of Congress. But I think that it will influence future decisions about who gets to make it onto the court, regardless of what happens during President Trump's first term. I think that if he has a second term, or if he does not have a second term, whoever is in the seat next will have to really process not just whether or not the nominee has a history of alleged sexual assault or sexual harassment, but also that will be an ideological litmus test in and of itself. Do you support the kinds of jurisprudence that protect people, not just women, but people, from harassment?
Well, I think that that's exactly right. And even though, again, we won't see it under a Trump presidency, this idea that sexual harassment could be disqualifying for a man seeking a high position, that would be definitely a historic change, and one that I certainly would welcome.
All right. Well, we're going to leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks as always.
Thank you, Jody.
Farai Chideya, thank you for doing this. This was really great.
I really enjoyed it, Jody. And Niki, thank you.
Farai's new show is called Our Body Politic. It is running on public radio stations around the country and also available as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of the Radiotopia network from PRX. Our producer and researcher is Jacob Feldman. Our other producer is Brittany Brown. Thanks to everyone who has been leaving ratings and reviews or helping spread the word about this podcast. You can do so in Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the podcast. You can also get in touch with any questions or comments about the show or suggestions for future topics. Our email is thisdaypod@gmail.com. There is also a contact form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.